Good evening. My name is Christie, and I'd like to welcome you to the African American Experience in Bucks County, Past, Present, and Future, a discussion co-presented by the Doylestown Bookshop and the Doylestown Historical Society. This evening, the speakers will be in conversation for 35 to 40 minutes. I will then moderate the question and answer portion of the event. You may submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen, or if you're watching from a phone or tablet, click the icon that has a question mark in a box. We will be taking individual questions and questions for the group. Please note who you would like to direct your questions towards. I'm now going to turn this over to Dr. Craig Stutman, Associate Professor of History and Public Policy at Delaware Valley University and Chair of the Toni Morrison Society Bench by the Road Project. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank
Wow.
you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Craig Stutman, and as Chrissy had just mentioned, I'm a professor of history and public policy at Delaware Valley University, where I specialize in public history, social justice and social policy, race and ethnicity in the United States, and Pennsylvania history. I'm currently on the boards of both the Germantown Mennonite Historic Trust and also Historic Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, Delaware County, where Marian Anderson, William Still, and Octavius Catto are among countless other nationally and internationally renowned residents. Finally, I formerly served as the lead research historian and writer of a National Park Service context study examining the history and built environment of African Americans in Pennsylvania, a project which was jointly administered by both the African American Museum in Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission. In regards to that project, Ivan Henderson, currently the Vice President of the African American Museum of Philadelphia, and Shelby Weaver-Splain, currently the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Pennsylvania State Historic and Preservation Office, along with myself, went around the state collecting stories of many of the lost or lesser known African American historical events and people and communities, and hope to construct or reconstruct with the help of both secondary and primary sources a template for nominations for either state markers or National Register of Historic Places properties. We did in fact write on Bucks County as well as other counties, but it's amazing that we were only hitting the tip of the iceberg in regards to reconstructing these stories from primary sources and also building off the backs of what had already been written about from state and local historians to church and community historians. Tonight, our panelists will broach the bountiful subject of Bucks County's rich African American history from colonial times to the present, from the stories of individuals and families encountering both slavery, indentured servitude, and freedom, escapes and aid on the Underground Railroad, the creation of intentional communities containing religious, fraternal, sororal, and other cultural and social institutions, as well as the economic, political, and civil rights activism of African Americans in Bucks County. Our panelists include the Reverend David M. Jackson, Associate Minister at the Second Baptist Church of Doylestown and pastor of the Mount Gilead Community Church of Buckingham, Pennsylvania. David served as an assistant pastor formerly of the Main Street Baptist Church for 10 years, and he was licensed and ordained under the Southern Baptist Convention in 1995. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in marketing from Hampton University and has been awarded the designation of Certified Meeting Professionals by the Convention Industry Council. David is the proud husband of Priscilla and the father to Naomi and Joshua. Welcome, David.
Welcome, and I thank you.
Thank you. Ruben Christie, a member of the executive board, is a member of the executive board of the African American Museum of Bucks County since 2018, and most recently was appointed vice president, where he is also the director of school programming. His passion and activities for AAMBC are focused on school and community engagement to inform, educate, and inspire young people in our communities. In January of 2020, Ruben organized a pop-up traveling museum traveling to many schools throughout Bucks County and central New Jersey that included Bucks County Technical High School, Trenton Central High School, and Pearl S. Buck Elementary. The pop-up museum experience has been a huge success and exposed over 1,000 Bucks County students to Black history. Ruben lives in Bucks County, Pennsylvania with his wife and 3 children, Amaya, Ruben Jr., and Preston. Welcome, Ruben. Laura Lomax, the CEO of Intercultural Works, and is a intercultural practitioner and professional coach who has more than 35 years of leadership experience, including 18 years as the CEO of a healthcare management firm. as the CEO of a healthcare management firm. From inception and startup to acquisition, Laura has focused on delivering solutions to underserved communities and governmental agencies, including police departments, sheriff departments, and correctional facilities in 10 states across the United States. Inclusion has always been a core value, key to employee engagement, growth, and organizational performance. Her recent experience includes creating innovative leadership building programs for individuals and teams in for-profit and nonprofit sectors. Central to the program, Laura administers intercultural assessments and offers cultural competence and humility programs and coaching. She has worked with more than 1,500 clients from the following sectors: education, K through 20, banking, healthcare, law enforcement, governmental agencies, social services, and hospitality. A Philadelphia area resident, Laura has traveled through West Africa, India, and Israel, where she lived in 2008 and 2009. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much.
And finally, and last but not least, Doreen Stratton. Doreen Stratton is a third-generation Doylestown resident, living with her sister Judith in the home where their grandfather Joseph B. Stratton settled in 1887. In 2014, the Stratton family began the search of their ancestors, coordinating with another Doylestown African-American family, the Nelsons, who share lineage with the Stratton family. Doreen is a published writer whose subjects include veterans, the environment, and social issues. Since retiring from the County of Bucks in 2007, she volunteers for the annual Doylestown Memorial Day Parade, is a member of the Doylestown Human Relations Commission, the League of Women Voters of Bucks County, the Central Bucks East, Central Bucks West High School Athletic Hall of Fame, and the Maasai Cultural Exchange Project of Point Pleasant, PA. Her blog can also be read at the Bucks County Underground Railroad, and we'll provide that link later. And published posts on that link include veterans, the environment, women's issues, racism, family and local history, civil and voting rights. So I'm now going to turn it over to the panelists so that they can share even more about their backgrounds, as well as their interests, advocacy, and or research into Bucks County's African-American history. Could we start with Reverend Jackson?
Yes, and good evening, everyone. I want to say thank you to the Doylestown Historic Society, the Doylestown Bookshop, and Dr. Craig Stutman for inviting me here. I also think it's important to recognize the Mount Gilead Board of Directors. These are folks that have volunteered their time to make sure that the Mount Gilead Community Church remains vibrant in the community. I'm working on a building. It's a true foundation, holding up blood stained banner for the Lord. And when I get through working on that building, I'm going up to heaven to get my reward. Singing in the African American community is more than just a song, it's communication. The church at Mount Gilead is on Hollycong Road. There's many stories about the church. It seats about 100 people. There's something very unique about it. When you walk into it, you can feel the hairs on the back of your arm start to go up. There's a lot of spirit there. The Underground Railroad passed through there, and through abolitionists, the Quakers, they took in runaway slaves. The late 1700s to the early 1800s. Matter of fact, so many started to grow that they built on to the church and established it in 1834. A desperate people, refugees, came running, men, women, and children, for their lives, seeking food, clothing, shelter. And again, I say the church was established in 1834, making it one of the oldest in all of Bucks County. The church was built in a one-room school style. In 1843, Daniel Yeomans and his wife Phyllis freed Black They owned the land about .07 acres. They sold the land to Thomas York and John Anderson for the hefty fee of $5. They became the trustees. And from the 1850 to 1880s, the church continued to grow. We understand that this is a very vital, important part to the Bucks County history. I'm here to share a little bit of that with you tonight. And again, I appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is Ruben Christie, and that was amazing that Reverend Jackson just shared with us. I am with the African American Museum of Bucks County, and I am happy to be here. It's a tremendous honor to be here, so thank you, Dr. Craig, for inviting me and to be a part of this. My story and my passion for the African American experience goes back not quite into the 1800s, but I had 3 kids that went through Bucks County schools. And one thing that I've noticed is that throughout the school year, during the Halloween period, sort of right now in the fall, I noticed that there would be an amazing amount of effort put into the celebration of Halloween. One of those celebrations included a parade where at a scheduled time there would be parents that would show up and park their cars during the lunch hour, and the kids would be allowed to dress up like ghosts and goblins and whatever Halloween costumes they had, and they would march around the school, and there would be such a celebration for a holiday like Halloween. But then when Black History Month would come around, there would be just a couple of posters hanging in the hallways with no real detail, no real programming behind the rich history of the African American experience. So I set up a meeting with the principal of my children's school, and by then it was my middle child that was in their school, and I mentioned to him, I said, where is the true experience and the research and the challenge of the teachers to come up with real programming for our students in the school? And he said, listen, a lot of that is left up to the PTO or the PTA, and oftentimes there isn't budgeting to bring in speakers or bring in artists that could share that experience with us. And he challenged me, and he said, well, what do you have in mind? And at that point, I took it to heart, and after researching and trying to understand some of the resources that were available, I came upon the Bucks County African American Museum, and I got involved, and I made a commitment that I would go back to that elementary school teacher and have that principal and have that conversation about what I could offer. And it's probably been 7 or 8 years, and unfortunately, even my youngest child was no longer in that school, but I brought to them a program from our museum that we called a pop-up experience, where we brought the museum to the school. And because of that work that was put into that programming, we were able to actually spend about 400 go through the presentation to almost 400 kids in that school. So not only did my child not be a part of it, however, many other people's children were able to experience what we did in the schools, and to bring the African American story into that school. The teachers learned, the kids learned, they were ecstatic at the end of the day. And these were elementary school kids that just received something that they had never received before. So that's my story and my commitment and my drive as to why I want to share this rich history of the African American experience. But I'm sure I will speak a little bit more about specifically what we did later on in our program. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I hear a little bit of feedback. My name is Laura Lomax, and as Craig said, I'm an intercultural practitioner and a coach. I work with individuals and groups to help them navigate differences. Can you all hear me? Because I hear a lot of feedback. So I was born in West Philadelphia, the late 50s. And every summer we would go to Wildwood, New Jersey for vacation. And one summer, actually before the Civil Rights Act, 64, I saw my father, Dr. Lomax, who was calling around asking about a vacation spot for his family of 5. And he would always add, and we're a colored family, by the way. So 5-year-old me said, "Why are you telling people we're a colored family?" And he mentioned that we didn't get turned away. And it was at that point, I think my parents decided to get a vacation home in Bucks County. So we wouldn't have to go through that humiliation. So it started off in 64, we were there for summers. And then I think my parents decided, because of the educational system, to move to Bucks permanently. And I talked to my mother this morning about that experience. And she said, she spoke to the church, who was our neighbor. And we never had any kind of issues. We were very upfront. We told them who we were. My parents were very active in civil rights and Black Power movement. So they came up with, full fro and everything. But they had a very positive experience. I have 5 siblings, and we all had different experiences. Some had a very negative experience, being called an N-word, etc. But my passion really is working with these organizations in Bucks and the local areas to help them really examine themselves and how they experience difference. One of the real joys of my career has been, I'm going to read you something, was working with the Bucks County African American Museum. We did an exhibit about Africans from Africa to Bucks County, and it's an amazing history. I'd like to read something that Dr. Tony Montero wrote for that exhibit to open as the opening statement. Africa's history is a profound epic of human and civilizational development. It is upon Africa's wide shoulders that much of human progress rests. From ancient Kush and Egypt to Mali and Ghana, Africa's gifts through millennia have been shared with humanity. Africa's deep and mighty civilizations explain in part how it survived the slave trade and colonialism. A vast continent with 55 nations, Africa has more than 1,500 languages and cultures, as diverse as its geography. Its rich natural resources and human genius were the foundations of trade, early monetary systems, and state building. Cities reaching as many as 100,000 inhabitants became sites of great learning, art, and commerce. By the 16th century, Europeans rediscovered the immensity of African material and cultural resources. The European-controlled transatlantic trade replaced the ancient trans-Saharan trade routes. The internal African trade slate and markets, as well as that with Asia, were made subordinate to the triangular trade linking Africa, the Americas, and Europe. The people of Africa included farmers, artisans, traders, painters, sculptors, scholars, judges, astronomers, and doctors. A vast and talented peasantry and working class were the foundation of production and daily life. All this richness drew attention. So what was really interesting is the history of slavery in Bucks County. And our friend Thomas Phillips has an amazing video, a movie called The North Star. But what was really moving to me was we had a wall that listed 300 names, children, adults that were actually enslaved in Bucks County. So I think it's a really interesting history. I think it's one that we don't hear enough about in Bucks, whether it's the school or the community. But I look forward to the rest of this conversation, and I turn it over to Dorothy. Thank you.
Hello, hi. Chrissy, were we going to wait for the PowerPoint, or you want me to go through it now when I do my presentation? I can't hear her. All right, first I want to let you know that this is a wonderful event for people in Bucks County to hear an aspect of the African American culture. It's really kind of always never, hardly ever spoken about. When I was in school, there was nothing. There was nothing about Africa. There was nothing about the Black American persons movement. And it wasn't until, I have to tell you, it was 40 years before I discovered exactly who I was. And that happened when I went back to Africa, because before that time, I didn't know who I was. And I used to go places and people would say to me, "What are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Black person." And they said, "Oh, well, I thought you were Hawaiian or Indian or Mexican." I mean, people just don't know. They look, but they don't understand. And I think that is a problem that we have here in America. 400 years ago, they brought brown-skinned people over here, and from that beginning until now, brown-skinned people have never ever been treated as people. We are still subhuman. And I don't know what else I can say unless, Chrissy, you want to do this now so I can talk about my family? I'm so proud of them. This is, we were kind of fortunate to be able to do an awful lot of research. And as anybody knows, when you go on Ancestry.com, you are finding out all kinds of things about your past. You are finding relatives you didn't even know were out there. And the other thing that it makes you realize is we are all related in one way or another. But I had put together a few things, some pictures of my family and a little bit of background, because we do have, like a lot of people, we have an interesting kind of history. So I'm gonna step back and wait until we see what, Kurt, if you have anything for us to do, and if not, I'll come back on.
Hi, Doreen. I'm so sorry. I'm unable to bring the PowerPoint up onto the screen.
Okay.
But I could, if you would like me to share it, send it to our viewers when this is over. I'd be very happy to do that.
If you could. But
Absolutely.
let me talk a little bit, and I think I did print out the program. The one thing I want everybody here to know, I'm going to show you this diagram. This is called Sankofa. Sankofa is a Ghanaian term for telling you that you do not know where you are going unless you go back from where you came from. And I first saw this when I went to Ghana, and they are telling you here that you have to reach back to the egg, because that's where we all came from. And you reach back for the egg and you bring it forward. And my goodness, that's when you find out who you are. And our family has been here we found out they first came here in the 1800s. The Stratton family came here at that time. The Nelson family came here a little bit before us. We are related. Now, don't ask me to go into that because it's really complicated. But as it turns out that someone in my family married someone in the Nelson family. So we are like cousins 10th time removed or something like that. But the Nelson family's history begins back in 1777. There was a Philip Nelson who was a slave in Leesburg, Virginia. And he was the product of an assignation between the owner of the plantation and a woman, a slave woman. And I think because of that, the owner of the plantation, Dr. Clagett, he had a relationship with Philip, where Philip was not considered a slave as much as some of the other people. And what happened is that he allowed Philip to leave and go north. Philip went north. He went to Philadelphia, and some years later, his son was able to also get out of Philadelphia, come north, and they resettled in Reading. In Reading, the Nelsons, there were Nelsons already there, and it seemed to be a place to congregate. And in the Black community, you will find that a lot of Black men, when they earn their freedom, they become barbers. And they were all barbers in the Nelson family. They eventually came down into Doylestown. And a lot of you people who live in Doylestown are familiar with Oakland Avenue, the house on Oakland Avenue, which is going under really serious renovations right now because the Nelson family that was there, they sold it. But that was like a hostel for a lot of barbers. A lot of barbers would come into Doylestown and they would work at the barber shop. A lot of you who are here, old timers, you know, there was a barber shop on State Street. And they worked there. And when some of them who came from out of town, they kind of slept at the Oakland Avenue hostel. And they either went back to the city after they spent some time and made some money here, or they maybe gravitated to this area. What happened is that back in Reading, in my part of the family, now, here is my there's my grandfather. This is Levi Garland Nelson. And what happened is my grandfather was out in Reading because he gravitated out there after coming from the Civil War. And he had buried 2 wives. They had died. And when he was out there, he met another woman. And she was, they married. And then he brought her back to Doylestown. And they found the house where everybody knows is down there at the corner of Ashland and Church, which we have been in since, the family has been there for over 300 years. The house, the property had been subdivided because we had to subdivide, but at one time there was a tennis court there. But the Nelsons and the Strattons have been in town. Within the Nelsons, there are many Nelsons who have, over the years, especially in our generation, our descendants, they have become very active in the town. Everybody was probably familiar with Randall Nelson. He was very instrumental in making sure that the swimming pool was open for people of color. He was a member of the Kiwanis Club. He ran for office. Now his father, Levi Garland, he actually was elected to council. But on my side of the family, my mother, she worked at the at Linden School, and that is also where Leon Nelson's wife worked. She, in fact, was in charge of the cafeteria at Linden School. Gladys, everybody knows, she was the school nurse at the Doylestown Borough School, and she was the one who first initiated the first polio clinic here in Doylestown. And Leon Nelson's wife, Louise, and my mother, Dorothy, they were they co-founded the first chapter of the Bucks County Lynx here in Bucks County many, many years ago. As for my family, that's about what I can say at this point. You're going to get this PowerPoint, which has some pictures and information about our background. But I do want to also say that for those of you, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of people on this thread who have already begun to research their families and their descendants and those people in the past. There is something about doing that it makes you more of a complete person, because you have found out something about you that makes you a better you. That's the only way I can say it. As for being a person of color in Doylestown, there were very few families. I like to say that we were raisins in a sea of rice. And when we walked out our front door, we stepped from being a colored family into a world of a lot of white people. We got along fine with everyone. The only incident I ever had in there is I talk about it in one of my posts. I think it was when the playground used to have that huge maypole up there at the top of the playground. Some young, I guess I must have been about 8, 9, or 10 years old, got into a fight with a boy because he called me the N-word. And we've had this fight, this fisticuff thing around the maypole. I'll never forget it, because it was around that maypole, and there were a whole bunch of little kids all around cheering and hollering. And the result was I got kicked out of the playground for a week. And I'll never forget that, but that was the only time I can remember. There may have been others, but that was the only time I can remember that I had to stick up for who I was. I'm going to close now, but like I said, look into your families. It's something you will never regret. I'm done.
Thank you, Doreen. Thank you, fellow panelists. I really appreciate the genealogical discussion at the end there. Do that as we move on. But I did want to ask a question just for the group now, before we get to audience questions. The first question at least, will be, Bucks County's African-American history is expansive from colonial Pennsylvania to the present. What stories do you see as being important, and which stories do you think are still left to tell? And that can be open to anybody.
Well, I think it's very important to note that as far as stories that need to be told, I look at Benjamin Big Ben Jones. Mm-hmm. Now, earlier Laura had mentioned the movie The North Star. That was done back in October 2013. The famous Jeremiah Trotter, the ex-Eagle, starred as Big Ben, and local Thomas Phillips was the film's director. Big Ben was the most famous of the Mount Gilead residents. Runaway from York, Maryland. The man stood 6 feet 10 inches, with a shoe size of 22. You could float a boat in this man's shoes. He lived on Buckingham Mountain for about 11 years before he was captured in 1844. There was a big scuffle, and he was seriously injured. He was then resold for the amount of $700 as damaged goods and sent back to Baltimore. This is a story that needs to be told. I went to the opening of the movie, was enthralled that all this was happening in our own backyard.
That's right.
I think it's also important to note that there's stories that are yet to be told. I've had the opportunity of sitting on the cemetery committee at Mount Gilead. We did this under the auspice of Megan Rattini. She was working on her doctorate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and she was able to uncover 243 marked graves. Some of the people that we found were Anne Hartless. That's 1861 was the earliest legible marker we could find. William E. Teat, born 1914, died in 2001, was a Negro League baseball player.
Mhm.
I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that my wife's great-grandfather, the Reverend Shillington, and his son are buried. She was given a Bible that dates to the 1700s with her family. So my kids are in their 5th generation, Doylestown.
My gosh. Woo.
We brought Charles Swartz from the Swartz Funeral Home in Newtown in to help us to recreate and make this cemetery come to life. And he brought in a gentleman by the name of Joseph Hefner. Joseph works on, there's only a handful of people that do what Joseph does, and that's working with historic cemeteries. He'd be the one that would go into Philadelphia and work at a cemetery where Ben Franklin would be there. So we had this blessing come to us, and we're still working on uncovering all the stories that are within this small lot right here in Bucks County. But the story is yet to be told. I do urge you to Google Benjamin Big Ben Jones, see his picture and how tall he was in comparison to all the neighbors. And also look under mountgilead.org and go into the church history as well. We do have 5 services a year, and we'd love for you to be a partner in our quest to uncover the real stories of Bucks County.
Does anyone else have any stories that they would like to tell, or they think need telling, retelling, or are lost?
No telling. Not that I can think of.
I think what Reverend Jackson said, just to expand on it a little bit, I think, can you all hear me? Is
Yes.
there feedback? Okay. One of the things that I think is sorely missing is a shared understanding of American history and African American social experience. I don't think there's enough of that shared. I think that we're almost in separate realities in a way. The writer Pearl Buck talked about it all the time, that you can't have a nation within a nation. It will implode. In so many words, she said that. So I think that really needs to be shared. I know that Black history, which is American history, is not really taught in schools in Bucks County or many places. And I think that's a real disadvantage to everyone.
I do agree with you, Laura. There is just a tremendous shortage of the education and the preparedness, not only at the student level, but also at the teacher level. I spoke a little bit earlier about some of the items that we did in our pop-up museum, and it was just amazing. We had 4 stations that the students and the classes would go and spend about 5 to 10 minutes at each station. The first one I think you spoke about, with the history of the African people, how proud the people were. We were considered kings and queens when we were in Africa before we came to America and became slaves. The second station talks about the Middle Passages and everything that we went through in our transport from Africa over to America. And the kids, they got the opportunity to see actual photographs of how the slave ships were put together and how we were transported during the Middle Passages. And our president, Linda Sally, she kind of takes it into bringing it into how it turns into the Underground Railroad and how we became free, understanding, just through quilts and a lot of the artifacts that we have, how the messaging of the freedom and what path to take to freedom and what houses were safe havens for the slaves moving north, how they were able to stop there and actually get information, get food, get clothing, and shelter before they moved further north. Reverend Jackson talks about, Mount Gilead and how much they have, very stops on the Underground Railroad. And there are stops throughout the entire Bucks County area. In fact, the African American Museum has hosted tours to many of those facilities as well in order to continue in that education process. And then, we continue on through the civil rights movement as a third station for the students to learn about. Everything with Dr. King and the movement there. And then we finally end up with what we call the hidden figures of Bucks County, where we talk about many of the folks that were first in Bucks County that either lived or continue to live here. We have the first African American race car driver owner, Leonard Miller, that lives in Bucks County, that many people do not recognize. In fact, about last week, when ESPN was talking about Michael Jordan starting up and being a race car owner, and they were almost saying that he was one of the first, or is the first, African American race car owner, when he took on Bubba Watson, who left NASCAR to come drive for Michael Jordan. I actually got on Twitter and I tweeted, "No, you got that wrong. It was Lenny Miller. He's been doing this for years," And so the people, even our professionals, don't have the rich history. Many of us don't know that, or many of us do know. Judge Clyde Waite is the first African American judge in Bucks County. And I believe to this day he still is the only African American judge. And then certainly, we have some very historical figures such as Selma Burke, which many people don't know about. Selma lived in New Hope the last 45 years of her life. And Selma Burke is significant because she was the artist that inscribed and created the image of the president, Johnson, on the current dime that we spend and use every day. So when we took that into the schools, we actually gave every student a little postcard with her, a small biography of Selma Burke with a dime glued to it. So the kids could actually take that home and realize, man, these are stories that I don't know about, that we've somehow been robbed of receiving through our educational system. So we try to do all of these things in order to raise the awareness and continue to do things that have never been done in our public school systems. So I'm really excited about it.
I wanted to mention something in regard to African Americans in the arts. I'm not sure a lot of people know that there was a film company in Philadelphia, and the only people involved in the filming, from the actors to the people behind the camera. It was all African Americans. And unfortunately, this one specific producer director, he did 3 films. They were filmed in Philadelphia, all with a cast of African Americans. His cast were usually, almost always, they were light-skinned Black people. And one of the films that still remains today, and every now and then it's a silent film, and they show it on PBS on Saturday night, silent film time. It's Scar of Shame. And it's really a big thing in our family because my father is in it. His band makes an appearance in there. And recently at the County Theater, we had a special showing of the film, and it was really unique when Daddy came on the screen. Everybody in the theater started clapping, like, oh my gosh, look at this. But his films, that is the only one that is remaining. And I know that when I went down to the Washington D.C. African American Museum, they had on the floor where they have all the culture, they had many films. There have been a lot of films that were created and produced and written and directed by African Americans, but it's really lost in our. We don't know about that, but that was a really important part of our culture back in the 1920s. The other thing I wanted to pick up on something else in regard to the quilts. There are a lot of people, and I believe in the quilts. I don't know if you'll realize it. There are some people who believe, there's nothing about the quilts. They don't tell a story. They don't mean anything. But I always like to say that you have to realize that when the Africans came landed on these shores, they came here with nothing but their language. And in most African cultures, that's how they communicated. They communicated with language in the way they created their wooden sculptures, and of course their beading. And in Kenya, they have a whole thing about the colors of beads, what they mean. But anyway, I always like to say to people, don't disregard the fact these quilts are real. Because you have to realize when these quilts were made by these Black people, they were talking to other people. And if you look at the quilts, and they all have different meanings, and that's the way they spoke, because they didn't know how to talk. They didn't know how to communicate. They weren't allowed to learn how to read. They weren't allowed to learn how to write. And this is how they communicated. So the quilts are important, and I know that there are some high-level professors that say, "Oh no, they don't mean anything," but I definitely believe in them.
I think maybe Chrissy, is it possible we could move to audience questions at this point?
It sure is, Craig. Let me come back in here. Okay, thank you, everybody. So we have a few questions from our audience. If you would still like to submit a question, there is time, so please do that by clicking on Ask a Question on your screen. The first question is in regard to the hostel for visiting barbers. Was it the Pink House next to the corner of Church Street?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, that was the Nelson House. And you have to realize, if you've gone by there, you will notice that they have the front facade still up, and they've got it supported. The reason that's doing is there was a very large, loud outcry about the fact that in the borough there are an awful lot of houses and structures, and some of them quite old, that are getting scraped. And there was a gentleman at the zoning meeting who made a very strong case about the fact that you are destroying the culture of this town every time you get rid of some of these structures. And that specific structure, the front, there's something about that I think it's the only one in the borough. And that's why when you go by there, they have that all braced up because they have to leave that there. They have to leave that. And as they were our relatives, and I just have to just add this: we used to have an awful lot of good fun at 168 Oakland Avenue. that was a party place.
We have a quick question in our chat box. Hi, Heidi. She walked away for a moment. Does anyone know exactly where Big Ben lived? She talked about him in her kindergarten class last week.
Oh yes.
That's a tough question because a lot of that history is suppressed because everyone was kind of incognito. And so you don't know an exact address. But they did have it traced down to 11 years that he lived on Buckingham Mountain.
He farmed at when you go over toward Hollycomb and you go past the Paxson farm and that road that goes off to the right. There's a farm back there, and I believe for a while he was living and working at that farm, and I can't remember the name of it, but I went on a tour with New Hope Soulbury Historical Societies, and that was the farm where he worked. It's still there too. It's a working farm.
And this is a question for all of our speakers. How do we move towards less discriminatory housing and zoning without burying the important contributions and experiences of past and current Black community members?
Well, if you're talking about a community like Doylestown, that's really difficult because you will see a lot of people in Doylestown. Many people come up from the city and they're working here, but they have to go back. And I'm not. That's not one of the areas that I have decided to creep into unless somebody else has an answer.
Hey, Chris, can you repeat that question?
Sure.
Please.
Sure. Okay. How do we move towards less discriminatory housing and zoning without burying the important contributions and experiences of past and current Black community members?
Well, one thing that comes to my mind is, at least, this is one case, but it's a notorious case in Bucks County, the Levittown stories of discrimination and racism as a GI Bill suburb in the late 40s and early 50s is created as a pretty much an all-white community at first. And the protest to integrate that community, at least in a modern sense, you could say that that's symptomatic of the Federal Housing Administration's policies of discrimination, and how that maybe is expanded upon towards our county's histories. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about was when I looked at the histories around the state is how many lost stories of African-American communities were in every county throughout the state, not just, I think we often default to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and we forget about Bucks County and Montgomery County and Berks County and Center County and and so on, and the stories that came out of there and the Mount Unions of the world that still are active African American communities to this day in central Pennsylvania, versus the communities of African Americans that left. Particular communities are there, as Reverend Jackson and Doreen and Claire, you've mentioned in terms of genealogy.
Laura.
And Laura, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. Laura, sorry about that. Laura, and Reverend Jackson and Doreen, in terms of genealogy. So I wonder if maybe you could speak to the genealogy. I wonder if that might be a segue into, you know, living and demographic patterns in Doylestown, class, race, etc.
I think they're around the time of the 50s. I think I counted maybe 8 families in the area, and there thankfully there are more now, and there are even more outside of the borough. But the borough is still there's still a lot of rice and very few raisins.
Yeah, I think it's like 92% rice. Doylestown.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Here's another question for all of our speakers. Could the intermediate unit be approached to develop a Black history curriculum for all Bucks County schools?
Yeah, I can speak to that. That's a great question, and we've been working with the IU for several years now. But what we've noticed is that, just actually going and reaching out to the principals, that the schools tend to operate in a very autonomous way in some instances. So reaching out directly to the principals and their guidance counselors and letting them know that we have a program that we'd like to come into their schools and do seems to be a lot more effective than going through, I hate to say it, a little bit of the bureaucracy of going through the IU units. So we tried that at first, and we weren't as effective as just reaching out directly to the schools. And I know there was another question in there that talked about a book, and I don't know if you want to address that as well.
Yes.
Maybe you can read the question, and I can speak to it a little. I think others may have read it as well.
Sure. The question is, how accurate is the history in the book The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby?
So I'm actually 50 pages into that book. So whoever asked that question is very interesting. So a little bit of the background is the book speaks about the contributions of the evangelical church to racism, where there were evangelists that were coming over and trying to convert slaves to Christianity, and because of the local laws that we had in the country, they were literally told to not tell slaves that if they converted to Christianity, that we kind of it would be okay for them to continue to be slaves, and that they should be honorable to their masters and so forth. Where in England, they had a different mentality. So whenever they came and they converted slaves to Christians, many of the masters would have to set them free, because they would tell them, listen, I can't have you be my brother and my sister in Christ, and I still be your master and you be my slave. So it's very interesting how the book is taking that approach and discussing that. Like I said, I'm 50 pages into it, and I'm anxious to see what the end speaks about, because I do know that in our history, the Quakers had a lot to do with the whole abolitionist movement, and we want to make sure that that's properly recognized. So I'm not sure if the book eventually speaks about the Quaker experience, but I thought it was interesting so far, 50 pages into the book. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has read the book.
No, I know that the Quakers also freed a lot of slaves before the amendment that allowed that to happen. There were, in fact, the Recorder of Deeds just recently, from what I understand, she sent the recent books that she set up to be restored, had a lot of manumission manumission papers in there. And the Quakers were very good about that.
I can speak about the Quaker experience. I grew up in Newtown, and Newtown Friends reached out and sponsored all the African American students at the preschool level and gave us an entire year of free education, which is amazing. I can't even explain how important that was. When after I graduated from college, I still went back to my preschool teacher, Dorothy Freiheit, and had tea with her because of how important the impact she had on me and my fellow African American friends.
Christie, there's also a question that just came through the chat that talks about growing up a Quaker and know that they had slaves at one time. And at the Germantown Mennonite Historic Trust, the 1688 petition against slavery by Mennonites and Quakers was actually sent to a Quaker meeting. And it did take decades for Quakers to finally admit that other Quakers were telling them, that they were not practicing what they preached. That being said, as Reverend Jackson mentioned, by the 1750s, 60s, you do end up having disproportionately white evangelicals being Quaker in the abolitionist movement, but there are and other evangelical groups as well. And going back earlier, Reverend Jackson, the beginnings of those protests from those Quakers and Mennonites in 1688, they were really challenging their own congregations as well.
So needless to say, if you can get your hand on the book, read it. It seems to be a very interesting read so far.
Let me get through Frederick Douglass first.
Okay, we have one more question here for everyone. It says, can you talk a little bit about the Black experience in Bucks County today? My boyfriend and I are an interracial couple living in Doylestown, which is kind of a rarity. We would love to get involved in the community more as well.
Can I comment on that? So I was thinking about that earlier today. So when I moved here in the mid 60s, surprisingly, people that probably never saw a Black person before, children invited me to their house, spent the night. There was some teasing, about my hair. And my mother reminded me I had a huge afro. But then I noticed today, it seems like it's way worse. And I don't know if it's images on TV and social media, but it seems like there's such a negative perception of people of color.
Yeah.
So it's shocking to me that we've gone so far backwards, to me. Let me add one other thing. My parents always made sure that I knew my heritage. As Doreen was saying, my ancestry. My father actually bought the plantation where my family was enslaved in Virginia. But they always wanted us to know that we were beautiful. When people were saying our images, that we were ugly, that our hair was ugly. And I know that kids today are dealing with the same thing of self-esteem, young students. So that's my read on past versus present in Bucks.
If I can just add one final thing as well, a lot of people, especially now in this climate that we are living in, where people of color are, they're getting shot to death. But beyond that, there is always this conversation from them and this bigotry about you're no good, you are weak, you are stupid. And all of us sitting here know that our culture and the motherland is superb. You just don't hear about it. And I dare anybody to say that we as a race are not a strong people. We're still here. We came across the Middle Passage. We survived slavery. We ran to freedom. And we're still struggling today because people need to understand this is our skin color, but we are people just like you. And I think that is the message that is not going to get taken care of unless they bring it back into the schools. You know, in my 5th grade class, they had a page in the geography book with a little African boy crouched in a hole. This was in a McGraw-Hill geography book.
Mm.
And in the background was this great fire coming across the plain. And the narrative in there explained that the little African boy was hiding in here, so escaping the fire that was coming, and it passed over him, and that is why we have curly hair.
Oh,
That was in that book.
wow.
So there's a lot of education that needs to be done.
And I can't speak for that this answer this question, but as an educator, I know, and as my training as an educator, I know as white and black educators, we have to do a good job of telling the stories of the past.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, from my position, I have a position of privilege, and I also, at the same time, I'm a historian, and so teaching history is about race, ethnicity, religion, class, and culture in our society. That's in world history. That's in United States history. So educators need to destroy these myths that are being taught, and as you said, Doreen, continue to be taught in history textbooks even to this day, based on particular state regulations.
I know, especially in Texas, they have some really winners down there.
We're going through this right now. I have an 18-year-old son living as a young black man in Doylestown. When he goes out at night, we have to have a conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
If he's with a group of friends, he's the only one of color, and there's trouble, he'll be the first one looked at.
Mm-hmm.
He has to understand that there is a certain way of conducting yourself. And I've talked to people of the opposite persuasion, and they said, I've never had to have that conversation with my son.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So therefore, the conversation does begin, and that's a beginning point. I recently had the police chief of Buckingham Township came to me, and we had breakfast, and he really opened up and said, we want to know more. We don't want to be perceived as the racist cops. We want people to understand our point of view, and we want to understand theirs. Can you help us? And we had a very long and poignant conversation. But he says, really, I want to hire African Americans on my staff. No one will take the job, and I can't get anybody to even apply.
Mm-hmm.
So pass the word out. If you have anyone in law enforcement, African American, there are jobs available here in Bucks County and even closer, the Doylestown, Buckingham area. They're putting the word out. So the conversation is lending itself to just getting a new reality, a new fresh start. I'm just surprised at 60 how much people don't know about each other.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And once you start to share that, you see all the commonalities. Then everything starts to fade away. I've been very fortunate to grow up in an area where I was in the 3% growing up in Newtown. Went away to Hampton University when I was in the 97%. And I came out of it knowing two things. There's good and bad on both sides. And number two, always be yourself. Don't try to be someone that you're not, because people can read through that. But you have to have that inner fortitude to know that what you are and who you are is vital and important and something to be cherished, not to be held under a rock.
Mm-hmm.
There's one more question that came through. If we have a few more minutes that I'd hate to not ask, and it is, what can we as individuals or as parents or as business owners do to improve the experience for African Americans and people of color, even if it's just one small act or action?
Good question.
Well, I think the one thing that can happen is no matter what type of slur is uttered and you overhear it, doesn't matter if it's from someone about white, black, LGBTQ. You'd be surprised what courage it takes to turn and say, that's really not a very nice thing to say. And it kind of shuts someone down right away. And if they look like they want to engage in a conversation, then you can say, well, this is something that is hurtful to people. And that is one thing that anybody can say, because there are people that throw out of their mouth some really horrible utterances, and they need to be called on it. And that's very, you'd be surprised if you're somewhere and you hear that. Are you going to say, all right, I'll have to turn around and say something to this person? It takes a lot of courage to do that, because you don't know what's going to happen, but you may feel really good when you do it.
Yeah, my advice would be to become an ally of this movement. I think there are a lot of Black Lives Matter movements going out there. There you will see people that share similar ideas as to what needs to happen within our communities. So get involved with those environments. Um, as I mentioned, I'm a big reader, so I just finished reading another book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So if you have not read that book, I encourage you to read it, whether you're white, black, or anything else in between. It really speaks up about having a lighter skin or being white and the privileges that you were afforded to through our history. It is a tremendous book to read. I think if you're white, you will get a lot out of it and you will understand the plight of the African American experience as well. So, read up, get informed, and get involved. I would say that's the best way to fight back the long arm of racism.
I had my best friend in high school. His name's Kurt. He was he was Jewish. His father was Jewish. His mother was Irish. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and he always said, "I wish I was you." And I said, "Why is that?" He goes, "Because when people see you coming, they don't tell derogatory jokes. When I'm in the room, they tell derogatory jokes because they don't know that I'm Jewish." So, in that sense, it kind of crossed barriers. When you start talking like this, people start to understand your situation a little better and have more empathy.
Mm-hmm. Well, we all got to be careful. There's some serious hatred out there, and it's scary.
I would say build awareness, continue to learn about other cultural groups, and also recognize as dominant white culture how other people are really walking through the world very differently, and just try to have a sensitivity and an understanding for that.
Well,
And
Doreen, oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
that's okay. I was just going to end by saying it's a paradox also being in a position of privilege when there need to be more African American educators. There's no question about it. Not only on the secondary level, but in the higher education world. And what all I can do is just be kind of telling anybody else who is white or black, but especially those who are white, to be activists, and to be activists not only in terms of being an ally, but also in terms of trying to learn the history and trying to preserve the history. It goes back to one of those questions that I think I may have even misinterpreted earlier, which was what do we do with the landscape, as things change geographically, as there's more gentrification, et cetera. And what can we all do? We can help preserve these stories. We can help preserve this history.
Education.
Well, I would like to thank Doreen Stratton, Laura Lomax, Ruben Christie, Dr. Craig Stutman, and the Reverend Jackson for joining us this evening. Thank you so much for giving of your time. Craig, do you
Thank
have
you
any
all.
closing remarks?
Well, I just wanted to second what you said, Chrissy, and thank the panelists here, Laura and Doreen and Reverend Jackson and Ruben, for everything that you bring to the table and all of your activism. I'm only in awe of you and building on your backs as a teacher in the classroom, echoing your words. That's what I would hope that I can do and what others hopefully will do as well. And please keep up all the great work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And
Good
for
night.
everyone watching, I will be sending Doreen's PowerPoint presentation to you via email. And this video will be available for replay here on Crowdcast. You can just log in just like you did tonight to watch it again, or it will be available tomorrow on the Doylestown Bookshop's YouTube channel. Thank you again all for joining us and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Good night,
Good
everybody.
night.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Wear your
Bye-bye.
mask.